Get off my property before I call the sheriff, Dolores.
She didn't even flinch, just crossed her arms, gold HOA pin flashing in the sun, and said,
Honey, this stopped being your property the second I poured the concrete. I run this neighborhood.
The smell hit me first. Wet mortar, sharp and mineral, still curing in the North Carolina heat. 10 feet of fresh cinder blocks stood exactly where a recorded access easement used to run one, filed back in 1994, decades before the HOA even existed, so 3 families could actually reach their own garages. She'd poured it the exact week I was on my honeymoon. 10 days. That's all it took to seal off 3 driveways and call it beautification. Dolores thought she'd won. She had no idea that little strip of gravel was the only thing keeping her entire subdivision from being completely landlocked. What would you have done in my shoes? And hey, where's everyone watching from tonight? My name's Hollis Renner. I'm a structural inspector by trade, which, stick a pin in that, it matters later. And 2 years ago I married a woman named Juniper, June for short, a hospice nurse with the patience of a saint and the sarcasm of a sailor. We bought our first house together in a subdivision called Cedar Hollow Estates, just outside a mid-sized town in North Carolina. The kind of place with a fountain at the entrance that hasn't worked since 2019, and a welcome sign that still says now selling phase 2. The house wasn't fancy. Vinyl siding, a half-acre lot, a detached garage I was slowly turning into a workshop. But it backed up to a strip of woods, and the previous owner, a retired postal worker named Warren Sutcliffe, who'd built the place back in the early 90s, had a recorded, deeded 10-foot access easement running along the west property line. A shared gravel path that let 3 houses, including ours, reach the back utility road without looping around the whole cul-de-sac. Warren had told me over a beer during the closing walkthrough that he'd insisted on getting that easement recorded with the county specifically because he didn't trust whoever ran things after him to keep it fair. Turns out the man had foresight for days. That gravel path is going to come up again. Remember the crunch of tires on loose stone, because you're going to hear it a lot before this is over. Enter Dolores Fenwick. 61 years old, silver bob that never moved in the wind, drove a white Cadillac Escalade with a vanity plate that said HOAPES. She'd run the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association for 11 years unopposed because nobody wanted the migraine of fighting her for it. She had a laminated binder of bylaws she carried to every conversation like a priest carries a Bible, and she had opinions, strong ones, about who fit in Cedar Hollow. Young couples, anyone who parked a work truck in the driveway overnight, anyone, frankly, who hadn't been born wealthy or who didn't play golf at the club she belonged to 2 towns over. June and I fit neither category she liked. The first unfair act came 2 weeks after we moved in. A citation taped to our door in a plastic sleeve, like she was serving us at a courthouse, for unauthorized vehicle storage. My work truck, the one with my inspection company's logo on the door, parked in my own driveway. $50 fine. I paid it mostly out of the exhaustion of being new and not wanting a fight in week 2. Should have been the last one. It wasn't. Then it was the mailbox wrong shade of black, apparently, according to a paint swatch she held up against it with the seriousness of a forensic examiner testifying in a murder trial. Then it was our fence stain deemed too rustic for the association's aesthetic standards. Then it was a friendly reminder, delivered at 7:40 in the morning, that our recycling bin was visible from the street 4 hours after pickup, which, unless you've got a robot rolling it in for you the second the truck clears the block, is just called Tuesday. Every fine came with that same tight little smile, the one that says, "I'm not being unreasonable, sweetheart. I'm just following the rules." Rules she'd write, interpret, and enforce herself, with zero oversight, because the HOA board was really just her sister-in-law, and one quiet accountant too nervous to disagree with her. June started calling her the Duchess of Cedar Hollow. I laughed every time. Neither of us knew yet how much that nickname was about to earn its keep. Then June and I got married. Small backyard ceremony, big honeymoon, 10 days in the Outer Banks. Phones off, no HOA newsletters, no laminated binder, nothing but salt air and the sound of waves that, looking back, was the last peaceful sound either of us would hear for weeks. We came home tan, happy married, and totally unprepared for what was waiting in our own backyard. The smell hit me before I even got the car in park. That damp, mineral scent of fresh-poured concrete, like wet chalk and rain on a sidewalk. I remember thinking, somebody's doing driveway work down the street. Then I came around back to drop our suitcases by the garage, and I just stood there, keys still in my hand, engine ticking as it cooled behind me. There was a wall. A real one. 6 feet of gray cinder block capped and mortared running clean across the back third of our yard, directly through the 10-foot gravel easement, directly across what should have been our property line, and directly into the exact spot where my workshop's future garage door was supposed to open. June came around the corner behind me, still holding her sun hat, and just said, "Hollis, is that ours?" It was not in any legal sense ours. It was Dolores's. Turns out, while we were sipping piña coladas and pretending the outside world didn't exist, Dolores had convinced the HOA's landscaping contractor, a guy who did fence and masonry work on the side, cash only, no permits pulled, that the association had authorized a beautification barrier along what she called the community buffer zone. She'd paid for it out of the HOA's discretionary fund, poured it in 4 days flat while we were unreachable, curing quietly in the sun, while we were 3 states away learning how to eat oysters properly. There was a laminated note zip-tied to the top of the wall. Of course there was. It read, "Encroachment resolution complete. Homeowner responsible for aesthetic finishing paint landscaping within 30 days per bylaw, 14.3 CD. Fenwick HOA President." I actually laughed. It was that or put my fist through the cinder block. Here's the first thing that mattered, and it's worth pausing on because it's the kind of thing anybody watching this could use. A homeowners association, even a genuinely powerful one, cannot unilaterally build a permanent structure on privately deeded land without either an easement that specifically allows it or written consent from the property owner. Doesn't matter what her binder says. Bylaws govern shared community spaces and aesthetic standards. They do not override a county-recorded property deed. Your deed beats their binder every single time. I pulled up the county's online GIS parcel map right there in the driveway, phone in one hand, suitcase handle digging into the other. Sure enough, the wall sat almost entirely on our side of the recorded line. And worse, it choked off the deeded easement that the 2 houses behind us, the Delgado family and an elderly widower named Mr. Castellano, used to reach their own garages. Nobody had asked them either. That's when Dolores pulled up. Perfect timing, like she'd been watching for our car from her front window with a pair of binoculars. She rolled her window down about 4 inches, the exact amount that lets you talk without letting the neighbors think you're being neighborly, and said, "Oh good, you're back. Isn't it lovely? Much tidier than that dreadful gravel path. You'll want to get it painted a nice neutral before the spring walkthrough. I was thinking a soft dove gray." Two's jaw actually dropped. Mine went somewhere colder. "Dolores," I said, "you built a wall on my property without my permission, and it's blocking a legal easement." She smiled that laminated binder smile. "It's a community buffer, Mr. Renner, approved unanimously by the board." Unanimously by a board of 3, one of whom was her sister-in-law. "I'd like to see that in writing," I said. "You'll see it in your fine," she said, and rolled the window back up, already reaching for the radio dial like the whole conversation had bored her. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled away, the same gravel that used to be a driveway, now dead-ending into 6 feet of cinder block. I stood there a long moment, listening to that sound fade out, and something in me went very, very calm. The kind of calm you get right before you start taking careful, precise measurements. June squeezed my hand once hard and said, "Get the tape measure, Hollis. I'll get the camera." The next morning I did what I do for a living. I documented everything methodically, like I was inspecting a condemned building. Photos from every angle, time-stamped. A tape measure laid flat against the county's plat markers. GPS coordinates pinned against the county GIS overlay, cross-checked twice because I didn't want to hand anyone a single sloppy inch to argue with. I called a licensed surveyor friend, a guy named Baxter Holloway, who owed me a favor from a home inspection I'd rushed for him during a snowstorm 2 winters back. Baxter came out that afternoon with his tripod and total station, boots crunching over the same gravel, the metallic clink of his equipment case, the only sound in the yard besides a mockingbird working through its whole repertoire in the oak tree above us. Within an hour, he confirmed what the GIS map had already hinted at. The wall sat entirely on our recorded parcel, encroaching by nearly 9 feet at its western end, and it sat squarely across a 10-foot ingress-egress easement that had been recorded with the county since 1994, decades before the HOA even existed. "This isn't a gray area," Baxter said, tapping his clipboard with a pen. "This is textbook trespass to real property plus interference with an easement. You could sue for removal and damages tomorrow." I filed that away. Lawsuits are slow and expensive, and honestly I wanted something with a little more theater. That evening the Delgados knocked on our door. Mrs. Delgado, arms crossed, looking like she'd been rehearsing this speech since we got home. Turned out the wall wasn't just an inconvenience for them, it had completely sealed off their access to the shared gravel path, the only route their moving truck could take when their college-age son came home with a U-Haul full of dorm furniture last week. He'd had to unload everything in the street and hand-carry it around in the rain, mattress balanced on his head like some kind of miserable parade float, while Dolores watched from her porch with a mug of tea and reminded him that unauthorized loading zones carried a fine. Then Mr. Castellano shuffled over, cane tapping against the sidewalk, and told us quietly, like it embarrassed him to say it out loud, that the wall now blocked the only path his home health aid's car could use to reach his back entrance, the one without stairs. He'd been managing on his own for 3 days, because the aide couldn't get her wheelchair-accessible van close enough, and his knees weren't what they used to be. That's when this stopped being about me and June. That's when it became about a 78-year-old man who couldn't get help to his own back door because a woman wanted a tidier view. I want to be honest with you, petty power, dressed up as community standards, isn't just annoying, it's a pattern. It targets the people least likely to fight back, the elderly, the new, the ones without a lawyer on speed dial. Dolores hadn't built that wall near the Hendersons' house, the family that had lived there since the neighborhood broke ground, and had a cousin who was a county commissioner. She'd built it exactly where the newest, youngest, and oldest, least connected homeowners lived. That night, June and I sat at the Kit Jordan table with a legal pad, a bottle of cheap red wine, and Baxter's survey report between us. A candle on the table smelled faintly of cedar, which felt almost like a joke given the neighborhood's name. Outside, crickets sawed away in the dark, steady as a metronome. Inside, the scratch of my pen was the only other sound as I started a list titled in all caps, "Things Dolores Doesn't Know We Know." "You're smiling," June said, refilling both our glasses. "I inspect buildings for a living," I said. "You know what I know better than anybody, where the load-bearing walls are. Every structure, every system has a weak point, even a homeowners association. Document everything immediately and get an independent survey. It's the single piece of paper that turns he said, she said into an open and shut legal case." Before Baxter packed up his equipment that evening, he did one more thing that turned out to matter more than either of us realized at the time. He walked the whole perimeter of the wall with a handheld GPS unit, marking a waypoint every few feet, and cross-referenced it against the county's aerial imagery from the week before we left for our honeymoon. The time-stamped satellite pass showed the gravel path clear and open, no construction equipment, no permits posted. 4 days later, a follow-up pass, pure coincidence, just the normal county imaging schedule, showed the wall fully poured and cured. Baxter printed both images side by side, dated, sourced, admissible. "You want to know something funny?" he said, folding up his tripod legs with a metallic click. "Most people never think to check if the county's already got a photo of the crime scene. They basically photograph the whole state every few months for tax assessment purposes. Dolores built that thing right in front of a satellite and didn't even know it." I taped both printouts to the inside of our pantry door that night, right next to the growing stack of everything else, and stood there for a minute, just looking at it. Proof stacking up on proof. The kind of quiet, boring paperwork that wins fights nobody expects paperwork to win. Dolores, of course, wasn't done. 3 days after the wall went up, a new notice appeared in our mailbox. Not zip-tied this time, actually mailed, which meant she wanted it to look official. It cited us for failure to maintain community buffer, aesthetic compliance, and levied a $500 fine, retroactive for the wall she'd built without our consent. I'll admit that one got a laugh out of me, loud enough that June came in from the kit, Jordan to see what was so funny, still wiping her hands on a dish towel. But Dolores didn't stop there. She sent a mass email to the whole neighborhood, 60-something households, implying that certain homeowners, she didn't name us but she didn't have to, everyone knew had been uncooperative with community beautification efforts and were jeopardizing the neighborhood's curb appeal and resale values. She followed it with a not-so-subtle line about how some people just don't understand what it takes to maintain a standard around here. June, reading over my shoulder, went quiet in that specific way she goes quiet before she gets very, very effective. She's saying we don't belong here, June said. That's what that email is. She's not talking about grass height. I won't pretend I know exactly what was in Dolores's head, but I can tell you what the pattern looked like from where we stood every family she'd targeted over 11 years. The Delgados use an interracial couple, 2 streets over, who'd been fined for unusual holiday decorations that were just their own family traditions. None of them fit the mental picture of Cedar Hollow she'd built in her head. Petty power dressed up as bylaws has a way of finding the same targets over and over. We drove to the County Register of Deeds office the next morning, mostly out of stubbornness, mostly just to see what else was in our file. The building smelled like old paper and burnt coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting on the warmer since sunrise. That's where a records clerk named Priscilla Ashworth, reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled the full recorded plat for Cedar Hollow Estates and slid it across the counter with the flat, satisfied thump of someone who'd been waiting years for a reason to enjoy her job. "You're going to want to sit down for this," Priscilla said, tapping a line in the original 1994 subdivision plat with one manicured nail. "That gravel easement your wall's blocking, it's not just yours. It's recorded as a shared ingress-egress easement benefiting 3 parcels, yours, the Delgados, and Castellanos. And it's the only legal access route to the rear utility corridor for county water meter service." I stared at the paper, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly. "Meaning your HOA president just blocked the county's own water department from reaching 3-meter boxes," Priscilla said, not even bothering to hide her smile. "That wall isn't just trespass, it's an obstruction of a public utility easement. That's a whole different letter you can send." I felt that calm again, colder and sharper this time. Dolores had built her monument to petty power directly on top of the one thing in America that doesn't care about laminated binders, a recorded utility easement. Pull your county's recorded plat, not just your deed. Utility and access easements are often public record and override almost anything an HOA claims. We drove home with copies of that plat folder tucked under June's arm like a trophy, windows down, warm asphalt smell rolling in off the highway. The gravel crunched under our own tires this time, the last stretch before the dead end. And for the first time since we'd landed back from our honeymoon, I actually smiled at that wall. Here's where the story turns. Baxter, digging through the county's public GIS archive for the survey, had also, out of pure nosy habit, bless him, pulled the recorded plat and permit history for the HOA's common areas. Buried in a filing from 6 years back was something Dolores had clearly forgotten existed, or hoped everyone else had. A declaration amendment that she herself had pushed through the board back when she was trying to block a low-income housing development from being built adjacent to Cedar Hollow. That amendment stated in bylaws language dense enough to trip a lawyer that the HOA shall not construct, authorize, or fund any permanent structure exceeding 4 feet in height within 20 feet of any recorded ingress-egress easement without unanimous written consent of all benefiting parcel owners. She'd written that rule herself, to stop a development she didn't like, and now her own 6-foot wall, funded with HOA money, built across a recorded easement without so much as a phone call to us, the Delgados or Mr. Castellano, violated her own amendment in almost every particular. That wasn't the only thing Baxter found. Digging through the HOA's publicly filed nonprofit financial disclosures, because in this state an HOA that collects dues has to file basic financial paperwork, he noticed the community buffer wall had been paid for out of the HOA's reserve fund, the one legally earmarked for capital repairs to shared infrastructure, not for unilateral vanity projects on private lots. Spending reserve funds outside their designated purpose without a vote of the full membership is exactly the kind of thing that gets an HOA board member personally liable, not the association personally, for the misused funds. June read the printout twice, at the Kit Jordan table, coffee going cold beside her. Then looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since our wedding day. Except this one had a lot less crying and a lot more scheming in it. She broke her own rule, June said. And she spent money she wasn't allowed to spend. And she blocked a public utility easement. Hollis, this isn't a fight anymore. This is a landslide waiting to happen. Before you fight an HOA requests their bylaws amendments and their financial disclosures, the contradictions between what they've written and what they've spent are usually where the real leverage lives. I pulled up the neighborhood's annual meeting date on the community portal, 3 weeks out. Open to all homeowners, always packed, because it was the one night a year free wine got served in the clubhouse. Dolores ran that meeting like a coronation every year. Nobody had ever challenged her on the record in front of witnesses with paper in hand. That was about to change. But we weren't ready to swing yet. First, we needed a plan that would let 3 weeks of silence do the heavy lifting and let Dolores walk right into the trap thinking she'd already won. So we poured 2 more glasses of wine, spread the plat, the amendment and the financial disclosures across the whole table like a battle map, and got to work. The plan needed 3 things: a legal spine, a physical demonstration nobody could argue with, and an audience big enough that Dolores couldn't just laminate her way out of it. The legal spine came together fast. Baxter's survey, Priscilla's recorded plat and easement documentation, and June's printout of Dolores's own bylaws amendment went straight to a real estate attorney named Garrison Cole, a guy Baxter vouched for, who specialized in exactly this kind of HOA overreach. Garrison read through everything in about 20 minutes in his cramped downtown office, the smell of old law books and burnt drip coffee hanging in the air, then leaned back in his chair and said the kind of sentence you wait your whole life to hear a lawyer say. This is one of the cleanest encroachment plus fiduciary breach cases I've seen in years. He drafted a formal cease and desist and demand for removal letter, citing the trespass, the utility easement obstruction, and the misuse of HOA reserve funds, with a pointed note that continued obstruction of a utility easement could draw the county's own attention, not just ours. Takeaway: a cease and desist letter from a real attorney costs a few $100s and moves faster than most people expect. It's often the single most cost-effective tool a homeowner has. The physical demonstration was my department, and it's the part I'd been quietly grinning about since the survey came back. As a structural inspector, I knew exactly how to make a point that couldn't be argued with in a laminated binder. If Dolores wanted to build unauthorized structures near easements, fine. Every homeowner in Cedar Hollow technically had the same right to erect temporary, code-compliant structures on their own property, including directly against the edges of shared common area frontage, as long as it didn't block anyone with a legal right to use it. And there was one driveway in the whole neighborhood that didn't have a recorded easement protecting it from its neighbors at all: Dolores's own. Her house sat on a lot carved out during Phase 2, and her driveway's only practical clearance ran along a stretch of unimproved common area frontage that, per the HOA's own governing documents, any homeowner could landscape or temporarily fence for seasonal community beautification with board notice which, per Dolores's own amendment, the board could self-approve. And guess who still technically sat on the board's landscaping subcommittee because nobody had ever bothered to remove me after I joined during a board Tuesday 2 months back? Me. I spent 2 weekends in the garage building modular, code-compliant, easily relocatable, decorative garden fencing, attractive white lattice panels, the kind HGTV would approve of, each one rated permitted and photographed from every angle for the record. Sawdust settling into the folds of my work gloves, the smell of fresh-cut pine drifting out into the driveway. Nothing menacing, nothing that looked like revenge, just tasteful, seasonal, community beautification. 6 feet high, exactly like Dolores's wall. Rallying allies was the easiest part. The Delgados were in before I finished the sentence. Mr. Castellano insisted on baking us a dozen empanadas as a thank you before we'd even done anything yet. The smell of cumin and fried dough drifting over the fence between our yards for 2 days straight. Priscilla, off the clock and strictly as a private citizen, agreed to attend the annual meeting with certified copies of the recorded plat, just in case anyone needs to look at a map. Even Ambrose Whitfield, the quiet accountant on the board, tired of being outvoted 2-1 before every meeting even started, quietly agreed to abstain from blocking whatever we brought to the floor. The financial trick the one Garrison flagged as the real knockout blow. North Carolina law, like most states, allows any HOA member to formally request a financial audit of reserve fund expenditures, with enough co-signing homeowners. We got 11 signatures in 2 days, going door to door with a clipboard, June doing most of the talking, because people trusted a hospice nurse's face more than mine. Once filed, that audit request legally froze any further reserve fund spending, including, delightfully, the budget Dolores had earmarked for a fresh coat of compliant neutral paint to be forcibly applied to our own yard. Most states let a threshold of homeowners force a financial audit of HOA funds. It's a legal weapon most people don't know exists, and it can freeze bad spending in its tracks. There was a fourth piece to the plan, smaller than the rest, but the one June was proudest of. She'd spent one evening on the phone with the 2 other homeowners we'd only heard about secondhand, the ones fined for unusual holiday decorations 2 streets over. Gently, patiently, the same voice she used with families in hospice rooms, asking if they'd be willing to simply show up to the meeting, and if it felt right, say a sentence or two about their own experience. No pressure, no script, just presence. Both agreed before she'd even finished the ask, which told her everything about how long they'd been waiting for someone to ask. We ran through the whole sequence twice at our Kit Jordan table. Like a dress rehearsal, who'd speak first, who'd hand Garrison the folder, who'd stay quiet and let the paperwork do the talking. Baxter joked that we were planning a home invasion, except the only thing getting broken into was a filing cabinet full of bad decisions. June didn't laugh. She just double-checked for the 3rd time that every copy of the recorded plat was collated and stapled in the right order. Because if there was one thing worse than losing this fight, it was winning it sloppily. By the night before the annual meeting, every panel was built, every letter was signed, every ally was briefed, and the gravel path sat exactly as silent and blocked as it had for 3 weeks. Dolores thought the silence meant she'd won. She had no idea what was about to roll into her driveway. Dolores wasn't stupid, and stupid was never the problem. Petty and unaccountable was the problem. 2 days before the meeting, she must have caught wind that something was coming, because the attacks got personal fast. First came the smear campaign, dressed up as community concern. Another mass email, this one naming us directly. It has come to my attention that certain homeowners are attempting to organize opposition, using outside contractors and unlicensed surveys. Baxter's license number was public record. She knew exactly what she was doing, trying to plant doubt before anyone could check. Then came the bribery attempt so brazen it was almost impressive. Dolores showed up at our door, no plastic sleeve this time, just her, in person, holding a bottle of wine, like she was there for book club, the cork still sealed, price tag conspicuously still on the neck. She offered to waive every fine we'd ever accumulated retroactively, plus gift us a $2,000 HOA credit toward any home improvement of your choosing, if we'd quietly withdraw whatever we were planning to bring to the meeting, and sign an NDA-style neighborhood harmony agreement she'd apparently drafted herself, complete with a laminated cover page. June took the wine, politely thanked her. Did not sign a single thing. "We're not angry, Dolores," June said, "and I want you to picture the sweetest, most devastating tone a hospice nurse can produce, the one honed over a decade of telling families difficult truths gently. We just think everyone at the meeting deserves to see the same maps you've seen." Dolores's smile flickered just for a second, like a bad fluorescent bulb. Then came the sabotage. 2 nights before the meeting, someone, and I want to be careful here because we can't prove it was her, though the timing was certainly a coincidence, called county code enforcement on my garage workshop, claiming I was operating an unpermitted commercial fencing business out of my house. An inspector actually showed up, clipboard in hand, apologetic look already on his face, before he'd even stepped out of the truck. He found exactly what he expected to find, a licensed structural inspector's garage, some very nicely built decorative lattice panels intended for personal, permitted seasonal use, and paperwork so clean he left within 15 minutes, mildly embarrassed for the whole thing. Keep permits, receipts, and photos of any project before your opposition ever gets the chance to challenge its legitimacy. A false complaint dies instantly against a paper trail. The last attempt was the pettiest and honestly the funniest. The morning of the meeting, we found every one of our recycling bins tipped over across the driveway, contents scattered across the wet pavement, allegedly, per the HOA's own posted rules, a violation subject to immediate fine for improper waste containment, a rule that notably requires the homeowner to have left the bin out that way, not for someone else to have dumped it there overnight. Baxter's doorbell camera, mounted at my request the week before, just in case, caught a white Cadillac idling at the curb at 5:47 that morning, engine running, headlights off. I didn't say a word about it publicly. Didn't need to. I just quietly forwarded the clip to Garrison, who added it to the growing folder with a single note, "Pattern of retaliatory conduct noted for the record." Meanwhile, June and I spent that whole tense week doing the quiet, unglamorous work nobody puts in the highlight reel, printing color copies of the recorded plat for every attending homeowner, laminating. Yes, we laminated something. And yes, it felt like poetic justice. A one-page comparison of Dolores's own bylaws amendment against her wall's exact measurements, and loading the folded lattice panels into Baxter's truck bed under a tarp, ready to roll the second the meeting ended in our favor. The gravel crunched under that truck's tires as it pulled into our driveway the night before, headlights cutting through a light fog that smelled like rain on asphalt and faintly cut grass from somewhere down the block. Showtime was less than 24 hours away. June made one last phone call that night, sitting on the porch steps, with her knees pulled up, wrapped in the same cardigan she'd worn on our first date. Not to Garrison, not to Baxter, to her own mother back in Ohio, just to talk it through out loud one more time before bed. I sat beside her, not really listening to the words so much as the rhythm of her voice, steady and sure, in a way it hadn't always been these past 3 weeks. When she hung up, she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I'd do all of this again. Every fine, every laminated note, all of it, if it means Mr. Castellano gets his easement back." I didn't have a clever answer for that. I just held on to her hand and listened to the crickets, and somewhere down the block, faint and distant, the low hum of Baxter's truck engine cooling in the dark, ready for morning. The Cedar Hollow clubhouse held about 80 people comfortably. By 6:45, 91 homeowners had signed in more than had attended any annual meeting in the community's history. Word travels fast in a neighborhood, especially when the word is, Dolores finally messed with the wrong house. Dolores arrived at 6:50 sharp, laminated binder under one arm, a fresh box of neutral-compliant paint swatches under the other, clearly ready to steer the meeting toward budget approvals and quietly bury our concerns in the new business section, item 7 of 9. She didn't get the chance. Before she'd even called the meeting to order, Ambrose Whitfield, the soft-spoken accountant who'd been on the board for 6 years and hadn't said a contested word in 5 of them, stood up and made a motion to move new business item 7, community buffer wall discussion, to the very top of the agenda, seconded instantly by about a dozen voices at once, chairs scraping against linoleum as people turned to look. Dolores's smile did that flicker thing again. I don't believe that's how we typically structure the agenda. With respect, Dolores, Ambrose said, I've read the bylaws you wrote yourself. Section 9.2 permits any board member to reorder agenda items with a majority second. We just got one. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the quiet, unglamorous heart of the whole plan. We didn't need to fight Dolores's rules. We just needed to actually follow them precisely, in a room full of witnesses, and let her watch her own rulebook get used against her for the first time in 11 years. She tried one more desperate measure, right there at the podium, turning to the room, and in front of everyone, painting us as troublemakers. I think it's important the community understands that certain homeowners have been uncooperative from the moment they moved in, refusing to blend into the character of this neighborhood. "Dolores," June said, standing calmly, voice carrying easily across the clubhouse without ever rising. "We've lived here 8 months. In that time, you fined us for a garden hose, a mailbox, and a recycling bin. And then you built a 6-foot wall on our property, blocking a recorded public utility easement while we were on our honeymoon. I don't think character of the neighborhood is really what this is about." The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the clubhouse's ancient HVAC ticking overhead, and somebody's ice cube shifting in a plastic cup of Chardonnay. Garrison stood next, laid Priscilla's certified copy of the recorded plat on the overhead projector, and walked the entire room item by item through the encroachment, the blocked utility easement, Dolores's own 6-year-old bylaws amendment, and the reserve fund expenditure that violated it, number by number, date by date. No theatrics needed because the paper trail did all the theater by itself. Dolores's face went through about 4 distinct shades of red. Her sister-in-law, the unanimous third vote on every past decision, actually raised her hand and asked quietly, "Dolores, did you know about the utility easement when you approved this?" There was no laminated answer for that one. An HOA president who's never had her own rulebook read back to her in a room full of witnesses tends to discover in real time exactly how thin the ice under her authority always was. Dolores gripped the podium knuckles white and looked out at 91 neighbors who were no longer looking at her the way they used to. "This meeting is adjourned early for a board recess," she said, tight and clipped, and stormed toward the side exit, heels clicking hard against the linoleum, past the window that looked out toward the parking lot. The parking lot, where unbeknownst to her, Baxter's truck sat quietly under a street lamp tarp still on, waiting for the next morning. Dolores didn't show up to work or to her HOA office, a repurposed corner of the clubhouse, the next morning. She had, however, apparently spent the entire night calling the board, trying to whip votes to override the emergency audit and shut the whole thing down before it went any further. She never got the chance, because at 7 a.m. sharp, 3 trucks rolled down Cedar Hollow Drive in a slow, deliberate line. Mine Baxter's, and one borrowed from the Delgado's cousin's landscaping business, gravel crunching under 6 sets of tires, headlights cutting through morning mist that smelled like wet lawn, and somebody's coffee brewing 2 houses down. Here's the part I'd been waiting 3 weeks to do. Using the exact same Seasonal Community Beautification Board subcommittee self-approved authority Dolores had abused to build her wall, and with my landscaping subcommittee paperwork filed and time-stamped 48 hours in advance, filed properly unlike hers, I put up temporary, fully permitted white lattice fencing along the entire stretch of unimproved common area frontage in front of Dolores's own house. Beautiful stuff, tasteful, 6 feet high, and it ran along both sides of the single narrow access strip her driveway depended on, the same way her wall ran across our easement, except mine didn't block a single legal right, because I'd checked twice with Garrison that her driveway's actual recorded access came from the street, not the common area frontage. The fencing simply framed it, beautifully, completely, on all sides but the street. Word had gotten out. By 7:30, half the neighborhood had gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and work clothes, phones out, the low murmur of a crowd building the way it does right before something worth filming happens. A local news van, tipped off by, of all people, Priscilla, who thought the county's own utility easement obstruction angle made for a genuinely good public interest story, pulled up right as Dolores's garage door rolled open to reveal her white Cadillac Escalade and the lattice fence framing her driveway like a picture frame around a very confused portrait. She got out of the car in her bathrobe, laminated binder somehow still tucked under one arm. I think by that point it was less a document and more a security blanket, and just stood there, on her own driveway, staring at 6 feet of tasteful white lattice, hearing the exact same gravel crunch and dead-end silence she'd handed us 3 weeks earlier. "You can't do this," she shouted, loud enough that the reporter's boom mic swung her direction immediately. "This is harassment." "It's seasonal community beautification," I said, holding up my own filed paperwork, time-stamped, notarized, board subcommittee approved per section 9.2. Per the amendment you wrote yourself, same authority you used on my property 3 weeks ago. Would you like a copy of the bylaws? I brought extras. I held out a laminated sheet. The reporter, a sharp local anchor named Beatrix Coldwell, turned the mic toward the growing crowd, and asked on camera whether anyone else had ever had structures built on their property without consent by the HOA. 4 hands went up immediately. The Delgado, Mr. Castellano, leaning on his cane, and 2 other homeowners we hadn't even recruited. People who'd apparently been quietly fined into silence for years, relieved to finally say so out loud. That was the mic drop moment right there, live on the 6 o'clock news. Not me yelling, not a shouting match, just a wall of ordinary neighbors standing in their pajamas at 7 in the morning, finally saying out loud what they'd been too afraid to say for a decade. By 9 that morning, a county code enforcement officer alerted independently by the utility department after Priscilla's earlier documentation had made its way entirely properly through the right channels, arrived to personally inspect the original wall on our property and confirm on the record that it obstructed a protected utility easement. Dolores was issued a formal violation notice in her own driveway on camera, with a compliance deadline of 30 days to remove it at the HOA's expense. 20 minutes later, faced with the audit, the news cameras, the violation notice, and 91 neighbors who'd stopped being afraid of her overnight, Dolores resigned as HOA president effective immediately, right there on her own driveway, framed by a fence made of the exact same authority she'd spent 11 years abusing. The wall came down 11 days later, well ahead of the county's deadline, paid for out of Dolores's own pocket, after the audit confirmed the original construction had illegally drained the HOA's capital reserve fund. Baxter and I watched the demolition crew break it apart, and I'll admit there was something deeply, almost childishly satisfying about the sound, that first solid crack of the sledgehammer against cinderblock dust drifting up, smelling like old rain and chalk. The same smell that had greeted me the day I came home from my honeymoon, to find it standing there in the first place. The gravel path underneath it, once it was cleared, looked exactly the same as it always had. Just gravel. Just the path. Funny how much power a person can put into 6 feet of concrete, and how little is actually left once somebody finally holds up a flashlight. Ambrose Whitfield, the quiet accountant, ran unopposed for HOA president the following month, on a single-line platform, "I will not build anything on your property without asking first." He won by acclamation. One of his first acts in office was proposing, and the board now genuinely representative, unanimously approving a full external audit of every fine issued over the past 5 years, with refunds where warranted. The Delgados got their moving day fine refunded. Mr. Castellano got an apology in writing and a permanent recorded board-affirmed accessibility easement, guaranteeing his home health aide clear access forever, regardless of who sat in the president's chair after Ambrose. June and I never did sue. Garrison said we could have easily, and probably would have won real damages. But watching that wall come down brick by brick in front of the whole neighborhood felt like more justice than any settlement check could have bought us. Some things you want fixed, other things you want witnessed. The community garden proposal came out of the same meeting where Ambrose won, actually. Somebody suggested that the strip of common area frontage where I'd built my seasonal beautification fence, the one that had framed Dolores's driveway on live TV, get converted permanently into a small shared garden and gathering space instead. Open to every homeowner, no fines, no laminated binders required. Cedar Hollow Estates now runs an annual fall festival there, string lights strung between the fence posts I'd built with my own hands, the smell of kettle corn and bonfire smoke drifting over the whole block every October. The modest proceeds fund a small scholarship for a graduating senior from the neighborhood, headed into a construction engineering or landscape design trade, a nice, quiet nod, whether anyone else notices it or not, to the guy who once measured a property line with a tape measure and turned it into freedom for 3 families. Mr. Castellano still bakes us empanadas every couple months unprompted, and every single time June tries to talk him out of it, and every single time he shows up anyway, cane in one hand, foil-wrapped plate balanced carefully in the other. As for Dolores, last I heard she moved 2 towns over, to a neighborhood with, and I want you to sit with the irony of this for a second, no HOA at all. Somebody spotted her a few months back at the hardware store buying paint. Nobody asked what color. Warren Sutcliffe, the retired postal worker who'd sold us the house and insisted on recording that easement all those years ago, drove out from his daughter's place 2 counties over just to see the wall come down. He stood at the edge of the yard in a lawn chair he'd brought himself, sipping sweet tea, and told me he'd always had a feeling that easement would matter someday. He just figured it'd be a dispute over a fence line, not a full-blown standoff with a woman who thought she owned the whole subdivision. "Glad I recorded it proper," he said, tipping his hat back. "Glad it was you two that ended up here to use it right." June and I are still in that same house. Workshop's finished now. Garage door opens right onto the gravel path. No wall, no fine, no laminated note zip-tied to anything. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still catch that faint mineral smell of concrete drifting from somewhere down the block where somebody's pouring a new driveway. And for just a second, I smile. That wall Dolores poured during Hollis and June's honeymoon, gone 11 days later. Paid for out of her own pocket. But here's what actually stuck with me. Dolores didn't lose because Hollis yelled louder. She lost because he read her own bylaws back to her. Section 9.2, in a room full of 91 neighbors who'd stayed quiet for 11 years. Petty power survives on silence. She didn't need to be right, she just needed nobody to check. The moment somebody actually pulled that 1994 easement, the whole thing collapsed. Not with a lawsuit, with paperwork patience and one good survey. That's what justice usually looks like, not a courtroom, just somebody finally reading the fine print. Most of you watching have your own Dolores, maybe not a wall, maybe just a fine that shows up a little too often. So, if your HOA broke its own rules tomorrow, would you have the paperwork ready? Tell me below. What's the pettiest thing your HOA ever fined you for? If this got you fired up, subscribe. New HOA Showdown every week. Because the rulebook cuts both ways. Dolores just never expected somebody to actually read it.